Counter-Narrative News, continuing with our special series on Roy Sawh, a pioneering black power figure in England of Indian heritage from Guyana, who was born in January 1934 to a very poor Indian working class family in the former British colony there, and comes to London in March 1958. We've been going through Hansib Publishers' 1987 published book on and by Roy Sawh called From Where I Stand. And we are going to finish just sharing the chapters from chapter 4 through to chapter 8. They're not very long. And we're going to just take them all together because they're so interrelated in terms of some of the grassroots initiatives and work that Roy Sawh was engaged in with other people. Now, we're doing this special series because Roy Sawh sadly passed away several days ago, and we send our solidarity and love and comfort to Jenny Lawther. So it's an important time just to share again, considering just the contribution that Roy Sawh and other comrades made of his generation. So let's get into the quote, and then perhaps we'll make some commentaries as we go through it. So chapter 4, quote, "The Political and Economic Planning Report of 1965 showed the extent of discrimination against black people in this country. The report had a profound effect on Roy. I was appalled, shocked, and realized that not only was something wrong, but that something had to be done. This was different from other times when I'd always known that something was wrong, but never went further to realize that something had to be done. At home, when things were wrong, you always left it to colonial administration, the whites, to put things right. He invited some black friends to a discussion at his place. This was a significant step for me. I was actually taking matters into my own hands in London. Many more meetings followed, some ending in arguments, others going late into the night. The prevailing feeling was that all problems which black people were facing in this country were a result of their disunity, so there had to be, at the outset, unity at all cost. We knew that there was discrimination, and we knew that there was no unity, so we concluded that our problems would be solved if we were united. The result of these discussions was the formation of the Universal Coloured People's Association. Roy became interim chairman. The organisation received a lot of publicity, good and bad. We were primarily concerned with the organising of our people. We had a lot of publicity because it was a new organisation and the first of its kind, but it was not the type of publicity that helped us. Maybe it was the rhetoric that we used and the way I would deal with people publicly on the platform, which was different from how I would handle people privately. I had the reputation of being a militant and an extremist. This did not help our organisation. Of course, there were problems. We were not a homogeneous group. We were black people from different parts of the world with different social, political, and economic backgrounds. We then set up a committee to draw upon a constitution with all the trappings of the constitutional parties in Britain. It was during this period that he heard of Michael X, another black leader in London, who was then still known as Michael de Freitas. Michael X was appearing in the papers where he was talking on the same lines of black unity. Roy had talks with him. An event took place which helped to radically change his entire political thinking. Black American leader Stokely Carmichael arrived in Britain. I spent a whole week with him, shared the platform with him. I talked to him, listened to him, and was tremendously impressed with him. His ability to grasp a problem and then analyze it in detail, find a solution, and then take steps to implement that solution was what really impressed me. There is no doubt that we were influenced by events in the USA and how our black brothers were there meeting the situation. We found that we were talking about more or less the same thing, but his solutions to the problems were not mine mostly because at that time I was not sufficiently politically aware and was not radical enough to realize that he was advocating certain fundamental changes in society. I was nearly on the same wavelength as he, but needed a jolt here and there to complete my metamorphosis. I still had not grasped black power and all it meant. He sent me on the road to it. Although the UCPA was growing in membership, it was lacking in direction and program. The leaders were being caught up in a personality cult, and this caused a lot of resentment among the members, who accused the leadership of always appearing on TV, in the press, and on the radio. We were being lionized by white liberals who started offering help and advice. Some black people had never been in such a situation before. From being outcast to lover boys had to have its toll, and it did. There was a lot of vying for attention of these liberals, which was what they wanted. I became very worried about the UCPA. It had potential, but there was something else lacking. Black people were joining, but were not getting the type of unity in terms of concise political action. Every time the question of action came up, we were arguing and fighting among ourselves. This was what the white liberals wanted. Roy then decided to go and consult Stokely, who was by this time in Paris, after being refused re-entry into Britain on the completion of his African tour. As chairman of the US Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and with his wide experience, we hope that Stokely could let us have the benefit of his experience in dealing with similar situations. We talked for hours, and it was during this period that the cause of our trouble of our difficulties became clear to me. Whenever we formed black organizations, we were influenced by the methods used by the oppressors. We tried to play their game, we modeled ourselves after them, and because we had a different outlook to things, we got entangled. In relation to black organizations, it meant we became obsessed with such things as constitutions and all the restrictions they had on one's activity. You might argue that constitutions are important as a safeguard against a one-man show, but then one-man shows happen whether you have one or not. If you wanted to take political action on something, it meant getting a 2/3 majority. You had to call a meeting, and by that time, the problem would have disappeared, or you had found that there was no solution. Western democracy is a game and a luxury that black people cannot afford. The constitutions are the rules of the game, and the people who invented the game also invented the rules, and once you invent the rules, you are bound to win. So I argued, why not invent our own game and our own rules? This meant that when the question of a constitution came up at a meeting of the UCPA, Roy forcefully argued against one. He argued for a program with aims and objectives spelled out, but not a formal constitution. His ideas were not welcomed by the rest of the meeting. Instead of fighting and standing his ground, he walked angrily out of the meeting. I was young and inexperienced and behaved irrationally and walked out. I regretted it afterwards. Here was something I had pioneered. It was my idea. It was my baby. It had come at the right time. I should have fought to the last and maybe even compromised if it meant playing an important role in the organization. But my leaving left the field open to others who were too attached to the Western way of running organizations. It was from this time onwards that I became a Black Power advocate. He had just made contact with Michael X, later Malik, who was just about to form his own black organization. They had discussions for weeks and finally decided to go ahead with Abdullah Patel, John Carew, the Guyanese writer, and others in forming the organization. One thing which they were all clear about was that there would be no constitution, only a program of objectives and aims. This was in fact a restatement of the rights of black people in Britain and how they hoped to achieve them. The multiracial approach of other organizations, like the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination CARD, was abandoned, and white liberals were kept at bay to avoid the experiences of the UCPA. The Racial Adjustment Society, as the organization was named, otherwise known as RAS, very quickly became an effective vehicle for organizing black people. Roy became national organizer, traveled extensively to various parts of Britain, and became well known in the whole of Britain. Ross had its own media and was slowly becoming a force with which the media and the establishment had to contend. Brothers and sisters, said a Ross newsletter at the time, you've got to learn how to deal with this white man. You used to turn your other cheek when he hit you. Stop turning, hit him back. The initials RA simultaneously make up the West Indian word for a sanitary towel, an obscenity, and an African word for leader. Such symbolism was appropriate to a movement which was to blend mysticism with militancy. RAS was important in its support of the 900 striking black textile workers at Cortland's factory in Preston in the summer of 1965. It was the first strike of black workers in Britain. RAS members in the area called for help. Roy, Malik and Patel went down. Although they had no experience in trade union work, they sued Courtaulds on behalf of the workers. This catapulted RAS, Roy and Malik into public prominence. Just pause a second. So let's remember back to the Race Today Collective referenced this strike and the intervention of RAS in that. They were quite critical, but we just refer people back to that video. If I'm not mistaken, it's perhaps the first in the special series on Roy Sawh, but please do have a look at that. To continue the quote, with this prominence came the inevitable internal squabbles centered around the personalities of Roy, Malik, John Carew and Abdullah Patel. It was an organization which was too top-heavy with too many leaders, all with their own idiosyncrasies, their own ambitions. Malik was a black Muslim and a disciple of the American black Muslim leader Elijah Muhammad, who had a great influence on Malik. I knew, Roy says, when I joined RAS, that Michael was a Muslim. I was prepared to work with Muslim and non-Muslim, Christian and non-Christian, solely to bring about a black movement. Then as time went on, I realized that Michael was a Muslim first, and instead of concentrating more on the political issues involving black people, he was concentrating on the religious aspect. This, Roy argues, was not good for RAS, as there were black people from different religions or no religion at all, and instead of uniting black people, it was driving them apart. The Islamic mysticism exuded by Malik rather impeded any development of a genuine black movement. This also worried Jan Carew, who was less given to the semi-religious rhetoric that Malik used. Carews' political attitudes were informed by rigorous logic, and he saw writing as part of the political battle. At this stage, Africa should be producing her own pre-revolutionary Gorky, he said, although he was too modest to see himself as any fulfillment of this analogy. I found myself and Malik drifting apart. I believe from my little experience that if you cannot get on with people in an organization, there are two things you can do. Stay in the organization and be ineffective, or stay in and fight. I decided I could not stay in and fight, and neither did I want to stay in it and be ineffective. I left, Roy says. He was frustrated by the whole experience, as he had gathered around him many people who were looking to him for leadership, which he could not give. The only reason people looked towards me for leadership was maybe because there was a certain charisma or charm, or maybe an ability on my part to articulate the black man's problem. I was indeed more interested in articulating the black man's problem. I was more interested in articulating the black man's problem as a catalyst rather than a leader. Although he refused publicly to attack Malik and other black leaders, his experience in Ras has left him very sour about other black leaders. On the other hand, his formation of various black organizations and subsequent desertion of them has resulted in criticism being leveled at him that he wants to be leader of black people. Some have gone so far as to accuse him of mere opportunism. To this he simply replies that history will judge me. His continued oratory at Hyde Park brought him into conflict with the police. On one occasion, while speaking on the subject of rights of black people to settle in Britain, he was harangued by a white woman whilst quoting irrefutable historical scholarship. She was so incensed by the logic of his argument that she resorted to violence. Roy was arguing that Britain was not a racially homogeneous society but was composed of a succession of immigrant groups, the Vikings, the Romans in ancient times, the Irish, the Welsh, the Scottish, the Huguenots and the Jews in recent times. Black settlement was part of this historical continuity of migration. Although she was Welsh, she preferred to see herself as passionately English. In the exchanges of viewpoint, she insisted that she was British and he was not. Roy, seeing the fertility of further logic, brought the altercation to an end by an ironic concession. Maybe you're right in your insistence on your exclusive nationality, but given your ignorance, you are a British object rather than a British subject. At this point, she stormed to his soapbox, hit him with her umbrella, and attempted to slap his face. Roy retaliated immediately and returned the blow. A policeman, ever watchful for breaches of the peace, arrested him, even though the policeman saw the whole incident and knew that Roy was merely defending himself. Although Lloyd Gifford, a sympathetic advocate, argued Roy's case in the magistrate's court, he was still found guilty and fined £10. This was the first of a series of oppressive engagements with the police at Hyde Park. On another occasion, when descended upon by a mob of young National Front supporters, Roy, with the support of some black people in the audience, fought off the attack and in the process bruised the forehead of one of the thugs. For this he was instantly arrested and frog-marched through the park to the local station and charged. Subsequent to the incident, the police would deliberately attend Roy's Sunday addresses and would be seen taking notes. As he stepped off the podium, he would frequently be cautioned that he would be reported to the Director of Public Prosecutions for inciting racial violence. A comic example of police oversensitivity to his presence and to the increasingly large numbers of people he attracted took place when he once replied to a question from the audience as to his effectiveness as a black speaker. Roy, with typical flamboyance and Caribbean wit, announced, "When I was in Moscow, the subsequent assassin of President Kennedy was one of the people who attended one of my public speeches in Red Square. And only last week, the man who stabbed the South African ambassador was standing here listening to me." The crowd exploded with laughter, but the humour escaped the police. The following Sunday, as he approached Hyde Park, he was swiftly picked up by plain-clothes policemen, bundled into a van and taken to Western Police Station to be questioned for 5 hours. I kept laughing and telling them that it was only a joke in the tradition of Hyde Park oratory, but they were serious and stone-faced. He was eventually released after having managed to persuade them of his innocence. Between 1965 and 68, Roy was arrested on at least 15 occasions in Hyde Park, a much vaunted location of British freedom of speech and expression. His crimes were various: obstruction of the police, refusal to leave the park when ordered to do so, causing a fray, all of which were unnecessary and undeserved charges. Roy says, "Such police action is a good example of the criminalization of the black community." Chapter 5. In 1965, the Race Relations Act, which was allegedly aimed at outlawing racial discrimination and activities which could lead to racial unrest, was passed. The next thing I knew, the police came to Hyde Park and told me that they were cautioning me and would report me to the Director of Public Prosecutions as I was contravening Section 6(1)(b) of the Race Relations Act. I didn't know how I could be contravening this act, as I had been speaking in Hyde Park for a number of years by then. I was cautioned a few more times and was eventually arrested and charged under the act. I then realized the witch hunt was on. Roy explains what it is that he said on that occasion. One of the audience asked me how I would solve racial injustice if I was in South Africa. I replied in a jocular fashion that in South Africa every white family has a black cook, and that I would ensure that every black cook would have half an ounce of rat poison. Upon a subsequent question as to how he would solve the British problem, the British claim to hate Indians because of the smell of curry and garlic, yet when you go to the Indian restaurants they are packed with white people. I would have to tell the chef to put something hot in the curry. He drew the audience's attention to the invaluable and unrewarded contribution of black doctors in the British National Health Service. You know that over 40% of British doctors are black, and if you get me angry, I'll have to tell them to give you the right injections at the wrong time. For these consciously humorous and harmless pronouncements, Roy was tried under the Race Relations Act. Roy was tried under the Act and was fined £120 or 8 months in jail, ironically one of the first victims of legislation instigated by white liberals whose target had been white discrimination. I well remember the moment of arrest. At 5 in the morning, Commander Newman, who was until recently the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and a group of officers came to my flat with a warrant of arrest and served me with a deportation order, which, however, they were not able to carry out. The whole episode was a bizarre testimony of white officialdom. I refused to pay the fine on principle and was sentenced to 8 months imprisonment. I spent 2 miserable and defiant weeks in Brixton prison and was released when a Swedish friend of mine, Alf Lundin, read about the case in the Times in Sweden and he paid the fine. He is reticent when pressed to talk about his prison experience. I can only say that prisons are not made for human beings. I wouldn't even want a dog to be locked up there for one night. The trial and fine made Roy a hero for the black community, as it did Malik, who also fell foul of the Race Relations Act, but it also completely shattered all illusions he might have had of British justice. By the end of my trial, I did not believe any more in the British system or in British fair play. All I was asking for was black people to have a fair deal in Britain, but instead of getting praise, I was convicted. His experiences with the police made him realise the difficulties black people encountered once they came into conflict with the law. As a result, I found myself going to the police station to stand bail for people, visiting tribunals, representing black people when they had problems with landlords, and slowly I found myself doing a sort of social work which had become part of my duty because I was involved. He established contact with lawyers and solicitors, housing associations and other voluntary organisations. This he did voluntarily. Some of his friends recognised what he was doing and decided to pay his rent every week with a small amount for pocket money. This went on for about 7 months. As the work increased, his shortcomings became obvious. I was not a trained social worker, and frequently I did not know what to do when a serious problem arose. I felt I had to have a little more formal learning in sociology. So after further soul-searching, he went to Fircroft College at Birmingham to study sociology. I was very pleased to be in a place where knowledge was being disseminated. I felt there was a lot I could learn. I had a problem getting a grant, but overcame that, thanks to various friends. But the usual problems arose. I could not sit there and listen to my professor without questioning him. The study of sociology was not related to the reality of the suffering of black people as I knew it. When we did economic history, he treated black history as being irrelevant or unimportant. And that part of black history which is related to the British Empire was completely left out. Naturally, I developed an open hostility to my lecturers and professor and gradually refused to take part in any educational training which seemed to have no relevance to the problems of black people. Roy became very active in student politics and was elected president of the Students' Union during the first month he was at college. He started to amend the rules and regulations governing the committee. This brought him into direct conflict with a resident principal and petty arguments ensued. He used to visit the Handsworth area of Birmingham and other cities in the Midlands where he addressed black workers. A lot of black people knew I was in Birmingham, and so whenever a problem arose, like a dispute with the landlords or a strike, they would come to the campus, ask my opinion and take me back to their area to talk to people. I found myself spending a lot of time in the black community whereas I should have been studying. While he was there, he organised a successful Black Power youth conference where black leaders like Tariq Ali came to speak. I was still at the college and at one stage found it impossible as I could not get on with the lecturers. When I asked questions about racism and the anti-black attitude of the white working class, no answers were forthcoming. I found myself in an institution which consisted primarily of people who were pro-establishment. All they were prepared to do was get hold of the dissidents among the working class movement, bring them to these colleges, socialise them and hope that they would go out as social reformers rather than potential revolutionaries. Frustration was so great that in June after the Easter recess, he was seriously asking himself what he was at. Should he continue? Should he return to London and maybe form another black organisation or join one? I just could not bring myself around to really see the role I could play in relation to black people in this country. He used to come to London every Sunday to speak at Hyde Park. Then one day, going back on the train, the idea suddenly hit me. It went something like this. If you're at college of the establishment and they are not teaching you what you would like to be taught, and since you do not expect society to do so, what then prevents you from creating an institution which would fulfill this need? Back at college, I sat up all night and thought about the idea. It had to be free. Black people in Britain are at the bottom of the economic ladder. The courses must therefore be given free of charge to all who wish to take part. I returned to London and discussed the idea with some friends. At university, he refused to participate in studies. I was a rebel now, he said. He started to put up ideas about the free university on paper. It would be anti-establishment, anti-institutional, and had to be a place of learning. So, free university. Free university for what? Afro-Asian studies. Third world studies? As I was a leading advocate of black power, and in my definition, and that of many friends, black as a political definition included the third world, black studies was the obvious name. So the Free University of Black Studies. I discussed it with my friends, convinced them, not of success, but at least of the potential of success. The management committee of TOC-H, a charitable organisation, made a room available to us at 24 Pembridge Gardens, Notting Hill. We distributed leaflets at Hyde Park Corner, and to our amazement, about 130 people turned up. And that's how the Free University, which can be regarded as an educational experiment of a unique character within this country, came about. Many white and black people have wanted to know why it was essential to have a black study centre in Britain. I can only answer by saying that it's important for us to understand why there are black people in this country and elsewhere in the developed world. European colonial policies have, over a period of years, resulted in people being actively drawn to the West for education and livelihood. Any group coming to this country will want to find its own identity if there is to be a genuine multiracial society in Britain. Integration, where there is absorption of one colour by another, assumes that the existing society is best. This can be no solution. In addition, there are an increasing number of British citizens who were born in this country but whose parents were black. Many of these people are suffering traumatic crisis of identity, and I feel that a black centre is part of a solution to this problem. Black studies in Britain can help to provide the necessary backgrounds to enable groups to be aware of their own history and culture and to take their full place in a pluralistic society. The history of black people has long been one of oppression. Once other oppressed people have found identification with black people and their problems, and so black studies has to come to mean the study of history and the present situation of all exploited peoples. It is important to realize that history has for too long been viewed from the standpoint of the whites, and that a valid contribution to academic thought can be made by studying history from the point of view of the blacks and by striving to correct the distortion of history as presented by the white colonial classes. My experience at Faircroft College confirmed this viewpoint. A growing library stocked with works on black history, books by black authors, and black periodical magazines from all parts of the world has been set up, and people lecturing the Free University had come from a variety of backgrounds, from militant trade unionists and African freedom fighters to authors, churchmen, and university lecturers. They all had given their service free. The university met on 4 evenings a week. On Monday evenings, African affairs were discussed, on Wednesday, Asian affairs, and on Friday, Latin American and Caribbean affairs and a study of Marxist-Leninism. Thursdays had been given to subjects like mathematics and physics. In general terms, they had been, according to Roy and others, very encouraged by the growing numbers of people, both black and white, who regularly came to the Free University and now were assured of a gathering of 40 to 50 on any one night. Students did not need entrance qualifications, nor did they study for examinations or pay for their tuition. It was organised by its members, thus creating an atmosphere for informed dialogue which educated the members of the university in a way in other places would have been restricted by the conventional student-teacher relationship. Because of this independent nature of the Free University, it pursued studies from the standpoint of its individual members without constraints implicit in a degree of rewarding system. The teaching atmosphere was relaxed and discussion flowed freely. To certain academicians, to certain academics, this might have appeared to be anarchic, but in the eyes of the students it was essential, as it did not reinforce the dominative situation which results when the relationship between teacher and student is an authoritative one. Over £2,000 had been raised towards a permanent building, 1,000 having been donated by the World Council of Churches. Roy's dominance in the centre cannot be denied. There is no doubt that the name Free University of Black Studies was synonymous with that of Roy Sawh, Black Power leader in Britain. An inquiry among members of the Free University revealed that they believed that the level of black consciousness had to be raised and the solidarity of black people expressed. This, Roy agrees, was a commitment to the idea of black power in the sense that black people having more say over the decisions which affect their own lives rather than a necessary alignment with the black power movement and its widely publicized activities. The idea of black power, he says, is indeed relevant to a society where there are oppressed and exploited people. It was this militancy which made the classes black in audience and discouraged orthodox liberal academics from supporting the university materially and otherwise. As Roy Sawh said at the time, we are now moving into the stage at the Free University of a careful political analysis of the black presence in Britain and are trying to relate it to what is happening in Africa and Asia, not only from a cultural point of view, because we don't believe that when every black person has a dashiki or an afro haircut, our problems will be solved. It is rather the economic and geographical location of one's country which determines its state of development. All this can only be done by knowing who you are, and where you are going. This is what the Free University intends to do after 2 years it has been in existence. In 1974, the West Indian World, which was then Britain's only black newspaper, was in financial trouble and a donation of £2,000 was given to the newspaper from the Free University for Black Studies. This was one small example of the way the university contributed to the needs of the black community. The work of the university assisted in campaigning for black studies to be introduced into the British educational curriculum. Bodies like the Inner London Education Authority began in a small, haphazard way to recognise the need and encourage schools to re-examine their syllabuses and teaching practices. Severe strain on the university's resources eventually led in 1974 to the disbanding of the organisation, with its members moving back to their local areas to share their ideas with their communities. Many of them made an input into the development of supplementary schools, which was seen as a stopgap emergency measure to encounter the failings of the white establishment schools. Pause quote before we go into chapter 6. So really interesting. Obviously, this is a book by Roy Sawh and about him. So it's gonna emphasize his role, and obviously there's many other people who are participating. Michael de Freitas is obviously mentioned, as there's several other comrades as well. In the UCPA, it doesn't seem to be mentioned, but Nigerian heritage pioneering black power grassroots activist in London and England as well, Obi Egbuna, was also involved in the UCPA, and we are going to cover him in subsequent episodes on Counter-Narrative News. So you can see Roy Sawh and his comrades are addressing the absolute important needs of the black grassroots, be it in developing their confidence through black power and their political militancy, be it the trade union struggle, situations at work, etc., in the workplace, also the lack of correct education for our children, and the oppression, the racist oppression they're going actually through schools as well. So constantly providing like serve the people, mass work type of things. It's interesting Roy Sawh is expressing some lack of confidence in terms of his community and mass work. In revolutionary socialist ideologies, it's well-established frameworks of mass work from Lenin's time or even before, but definitely and explicitly from Lenin and in Mao, you can find this, and the Black Panthers are probably the most well-known of implementing that type of mass work through their Serve the People programs. So let's continue. Chapter 6, quote, "Looking back over the whole venture, Roy explained how white liberals played an important role at the inception of the Free University for Black Studies, but had subsequently slowly withdrawn their involvement and support. Part of the blame for the demise of the UCPA was also placed at the doorstep of white liberals. I think in the early days of our struggle, a lot of black people had a lot of hope and confidence in white liberals. They were glad to meet whites who were not racist, who were not openly hostile to them, and who were prepared to listen and do something. I think at one stage of our development, we generally believed that white liberals were our friends." Pause. Now, this critique of white liberals and the white left, etc., is important. It still continues today. Everything has to be black and brown led. It creates a healthy situation rather than this preponderance of this annoying, unethical control by the white left and the white liberals. And that's all very important. But put it into its historical context, it's the time of the fruition and the coming to the surface of black power radical politics at the grassroots. So once that's achieved, and that's really important, then if white liberals and white lefts are trying to drag that back and be controlling, that's just a really bad situation. So it's very important what Roy Sawh is saying. It's also quite fascinating, really, looking at all of this and thinking about one's own kind of political commitments over the last several decades and how there's so many parallels, and even not knowing some of the histories, just being loyal to the revolutionary struggles and legacies and ideologies, you find yourself employing similar frameworks at the grassroots of yesteryear and yestergeneration, because the system still exists and the system continues to sophisticate itself, and so the strategies and the tactics and the frameworks are still relevant. But to continue the quote, as time progressed, we found that white liberals wanted to control us. They wanted to tell us what to do and how to do our thing. They lionized us. As a result, we listened more to them than to our own people. And as a result, we lost contact with our people. As we realized what they were up to and became more articulate and independent, they felt that they were being cut off. Well, they were cut off because their attitudes were often patronizing, condescending. Never mind, everything is going to be all right. I'm here to help you, is how they felt. They wanted their own solution and would have tied us to a system we did not want to be a part of anyway. In April 1969, prior to the formation of the Free University for Black Studies, and after he had parted with Michael X, Roy, together with Jagmohan Joshi, Birmingham leader of the Indian Workers' Association of Great Britain, had successfully established the Black People's Alliance, BPA, which had about 50 organizations affiliated to it by 1970. The BPA, which organized the Rhodesian demonstration that ended with the attack on the South African House in January 1969, was perhaps the nearest thing to a national black power body, although essentially its strength derived from Joshi's Birmingham following. Just pause. So Jagmohan Joshi leads the Indian Workers' Association in Birmingham. The IWA splits between, on the one hand, the pro-Moscow Soviet faction, which is also connected to the British Labour Party, and then the other faction connected to the more radical, relatively Beijing Mao faction, which is also hostile to the British Labour Party. And just oneself, I was a member of the Indian Workers' Association of Great Britain, of the continuation of Jagmohan Joshi's faction. Jagmohan Joshi passes away around 1979, 1980, and then this very problematic, controversial and destructive figure at the grassroots, Harpal Brar, a Indian Punjabi landed aristocrat, takes over and ends up in more recent times allying up with Brexit and supporting Trump and all of this nonsense, but perhaps we can explore that another time. But just to say that counter-narrative news is directly part of these traditions and these streams and organizations. To continue the quote, this mosaic of group muscles was deceptive, however. We were all very temperamental people, says Roy. We fought and argued like hell, but this fighting and arguing was where we got most of our thinking done. We tolerated each other immensely. But how much? The events surrounding his call early in 1969 for a May Day strike by black workers were typical of the weaknesses that afflict black organizations here. Roy made the call on his own initiative and was promptly disowned by the Black People's Alliance, which he helped to establish only a year before. It was a result of internal jealousies, he said. Roy wanted to do things all by himself, a BPA militant claimed at the time. As a result, Roy drifted away from the Black People's Alliance, although he never denounced or acted against them. After this experience, he spent most of the time organizing the Free University for Black Studies, and put so much work and effort into it that other black leaders were quite surprised. Roy was drifting no more, it seems. He had finally reached a point of political stability, one said. This is what I wanted all the time, he said, a base from which ideas for action could grow. It was a battleground for the mind and soul. From here, cadres for the Black Revolution, which I saw coming soon, were being nurtured. I saw the next 10 years of being crucial as far as black people were concerned in this country. I would envisage black people physically deported from this country. They would primarily be the older immigrants, and statisticians would argue that we were old and could not contribute any more towards things here. By that time, they would have children in their early 20s. With conditions as they were, bad educational facilities, high employment, these youngsters would not have learned any skilled trades, nor would they be literate. With this society moving into the technological age in terms of heavy industry and computerization, a lot of black youth would find themselves doing manual jobs. There would be frustration, there were signs already, and unlike their parents, they would not sit back and wait for somebody to come and change things. The result appeared obvious. Others would turn to petty crime, for example, involving drugs, which were becoming a real problem amongst youth. This was the biggest problem because black people and drugs were slowly becoming synonymous. They were getting worse daily. Black kids on the street corners, no social facilities, clashes with the police and the establishment as a whole. They were already considering themselves outsiders in our society. The generation gap between their parents and themselves was widening. The establishment through the police and the various laws which hit at black people was further alienating them. Putting all this together, it was clear to me at the time that the black youth would in 10 years hence become the real danger. The apathy which earlier manifested itself in sullenness and so-called laziness would become the anger of tomorrow, and that anger would be channeled into a very destructive role. I saw that in 10 years' time we would have the same situation as in the United States repeating itself here. Yes, even I was afraid because I knew what was bottled up inside those frustrated youths. I hoped that the Free University could in some way help to channel that anger to something constructive, but I was not sure. Pause quote. Of course, this was published in 87, and the period between 1979 and 1981 sees African, Caribbean, and Asian heritage youth through unifying through the radical black politics and black power rise up really, really militantly and violently over 12 different cities, at least from 1979 to 81. So it was quite a kind of prophetic strategy that these comrades were employing, and very necessary indeed to educating that new generation that Roy Sawh very importantly states. And the counter-narrative news episodes, again and again and again, we hammering home through our research and advocacy and sharing our episodes about the political, cultural galvanization and processes that leads to rebellion, but also those counter-revolutionary, reactionary forces that leads to relative defeats and negligible capacity and an acceptance of oppression. Final chapter, chapter 7, quote, although Roy Sawh is strongly influenced by Marxism, he is not purely a Marxist. I needed a two-pronged ideology, he says, one to understand the economics of racism and one to understand the economics of class. But is there not a conflict somewhere in this strategy? I don't see a conflict. As a Marxist, I recognize that there are members of the white working class who are oppressed. But I also realize that the majority of the white working class discriminate against me, rightly or wrongly, because I am black. I accept the class analysis as a Marxist, and I accept that when the economic structure changes, then these problems will disappear. But I'm not the type of Marxist who will sit back and wait for the super economic structure to change before any problems as a black person change. I know that they are against me, not because I am an accountant, but because I am black. The people who are against me, against blacks, are not the white elite, because we never really meet them. It is not with the white middle class. It is with the working class, the very people with whom we're supposed to have everything in common. They see in the black artisan, the black worker, an economic threat to their jobs, a threat which the white middle class does not see. I cannot resolve this problem, despite the claims by other Marxists who say I have everything in common with the white working class. The only thing I can say to them is, well, don't tell me that. Tell the person who discriminates against me, the white worker, educate him, not me. I see our task first in organizing black people and making them aware of their position. Then I see the possibilities of further politicizing in line with a Marxist class analysis. He denies that this thesis leads to polarization of force, on the one side black and on the other white, which will inevitably lead to a racial battle. When black people stand on their own as decent human beings in this country, white people will respect them. As long as black people have no confidence in themselves, as long as they are weak, they will be scapegoats for oppression. Once they are strong and well organized, they will be respected and racism will be eased. Did this imply that until black people were organized, they stay aloof from issues which, as part of the community at large, concern them as much as white people, issues such as community action and participation in the electoral process? Why has there been little attempt to play conventional political games? I am not sure that I welcome community work where the emphasis is purely on community work. If it leads towards a political realization of our problem, then it's alright, but I'm afraid that it becomes a safety valve for the system and deters black people from action. At one time, Roy announced his intention to stand in the South Kensington by-election, but withdrew before nomination day. I withdrew because I had no faith in the constitutional process as it relates to black people. Some black people point to this action of his as another sign of his opportunism. Roy was prepared to play the white man's game for a few years ago, one black leader said. He only withdrew because black people looked with real opprobrium on any participation. There are black people, Roy says, who feel part of British society, like the system, and they like the system and sometimes don't understand its mechanism. They think a few reforms will alter the system and make things better for them. I don't go for this idea completely, but I do agree that there are certain instances where the constitutional machinery can be used to help certain sections of the black community. This unfortunately tends to create the situation where those black people then think the system is good. Where black people are a substantial number in a community and where it's possible for them to put up candidates, they should. In this way, they can represent the interests of black people as far as housing, rents, etc. are concerned, but I would not concentrate all energies towards this kind of activity. Also, putting up black candidates and not getting them elected or getting them elected and exposing the limitation helps the further disillusionment of the electoral processes and the four established British political parties. Although I want no part of capitalism or racism, and my aim still remains to destroy the source of racism, for those who still feel that there is something left in the society which is redeemable, then there is the ballot box. I am prepared to go along with this view, but I am convinced we are taking part in a masochistic exercise. Pause quote. Very much so, deeply problematic engaging in the colonial capitalist election process. History has proven it does nearly nothing to advance the class struggle for the black working class. And really, the period of the 80s is the period where everything is destroyed largely at the radical grassroots. And a major part of that is not only state funding to corrupt and to neutralize radicalism, but also the election of a whole spate of black MPs, Paul Boating, Diane Abbott, Bernie Grant, and this just totally sabotages the radical grassroots if we're going to think that these people are going to do anything but to actually do whatever they can to fatten their already big colonial salaries. Final chapter, chapter 8, quote, in early 1971, 13 years after he had boarded penniless that third-class Italian boat to Southampton, a nattily dressed Roy Sawh disembarked from the Prince of Netherlands boat at Georgetown, Guyana. There was a crowd to meet him this time. The Georgetown papers had announced his arrival. One headline read, Roy Sawh, Guyanese leader in Britain, returns home on visit, with a 2-column picture of him and a 10-inch write-up. It was a satisfying recognition, he surmised. He had been looking forward to his trip for years and was keen to see the progress that had been made in this country during his absence. He was impressed with the new airport, which he later visited, although he could not remember how the old one looked as he had not seen it when he was in Georgetown 13 years ago. He has also visited other West Indian territories and was disgusted by what he saw. He said, I was full of expectations, great ones at that. I came back sympathetic and hopeful, but left disappointed. The poor had got poorer and the rich richer. More West Indian countries had become more corrupt. Independence was only a facade. So much so that any politician who genuinely believed in social justice would not even attempt to use the parliamentary machine. Did he then advocate a violent overthrow of the existing governments as the only way out? In one of his speeches at that time, he addressed himself to this question. Today in the West Indies, we have black leaders who have taken political control of an economic order which is determined by Western countries. They are therefore running a system which is exploitative, which is determined to exploit the majority of the people in order that a few can be beneficiaries. Comparably, the corruption which took place under Batista in Cuba is there in the West Indies today. It is a similar situation to the one before Castro took over. When socialism comes to the West Indies, it will go through a transitional stage. It will take time, and in that process there will be counter-revolution, and you will have foreign intervention to safeguard their interests. There might be civil wars, killings might take place, but this should not deter us, because if we're going to worry about people who will die or will be killed, then there will be no change in the society whatsoever. Only a Cuban type of revolution will be the answer to the problems in the West Indies. It seems he did not see anything amiss in the aspect of dependence of Cuba on the Soviet Union or the possibility of any future socialist Caribbean country being dependent on the Soviet Union or other East European countries. Neither did his earlier anti-Soviet utterances and activities prevent him from saying that if socialism was to come to Guyana or the West Indies, it would have to depend in its early stages on fraternal countries and on socialist countries. The question of total independence does not become an issue. What is important is to establish contacts with friendly socialist countries in order to give time for change. Then you might see some kind of independence. Fighting words. But how was he going to put them into operation? This he did not seem to have worked out. The black people returning from Britain to the West Indies are so quickly and so easily bought over by good government jobs that you cannot look to many of them for support for any sustained movement way back home. That is one of the difficult jobs we have here in Britain. Many come to this country penniless and with little education. Those who go back return better educated, better off financially. The burden of any change lies with us who remain here. It is our job to bring change here and in that way help to weaken one of the external supports which prop up unpopular governments way back home. Upon termination of his holidays in Guyana, he flew back to England via the West Indian Islands, but his reputation as a Black Power activist had preceded him. A Black Power conference was being planned in Bermuda with talk of setting up Black Power cells all over the Caribbean. He was harassed by immigration officials at Trinidad's airport and allowed only 24 hours stopover. He flew on to Grenada to see Maurice Bishop, who he had known in London, but after 5 days' sojourn there, an inspector of police came to his hotel, declared that he was a persona non grata and escorted him to the airport. A plane took him to Barbados, and the immigration authorities there, after an hour of interrogation, gave him enough time to catch the next plane out of the country, irrespective of its destination. The next flight was from Barbados to Bermuda, but on landing at the airport there, Roy was refused permission to land. Fortunately, the same plane flew on to London. I had to work for the next 3 years, paying for all those unnecessary plane fares, he says Riley. End of quote. Yes, and very much so, the West Indian authorities of the different constituent states in the Caribbean were absolutely terrified at the time of the upsurge of revolutionary Black Power, working class, socialist-oriented resistance. So yeah, absolutely, people like Roy Sawh, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Walter Rodney, and others would have been censored and barred entry there. There's an interesting issue here in terms of the Black Power strategy when it comes to the black grassroots and the relationship to white workers, etc. This was actually something covered. First of all, this whole politics is resolved by around the First World War to 1920 by Lenin and Amin Roy and James Connolly and others in terms of the primary importance of putting right at the front opposing white supremacy and colonial racism and nationalisms, and that the only people to do that are the colonized, the black working class. That's established by 1920 very, very clearly and given global leadership. By the 1930s, actually, C.L.R. James is advocating brilliantly, similarly, in the communist movements in the Caribbean, in Britain, in the US, and generally. Of course, he's in the Trotskyist movement, but he has relationships outside of that as well with other kind of trends in the radical Marxist and socialist movements. All really interesting things. So this brings to a close the 4th episode of our series in Roy Sawh. We will continue. This is a really important period, the late 50s through to the 70s, really, in terms of the height of our confidence politically and culturally, the height of our creativity in the arts, informed by our political radicalism of the Black Power culture, etc. So we will continuously produce more episodes around this to inform and reflect and to learn what happened then, to understand what's happening now, to hopefully contribute to a healthier liberation struggle going forward. Many thanks.